Let me tell you about Ji-hoon Jung. This man? He's the kind of guy who walks into a room and everyone holds their breath. Literally. The king of Seoul's underworld. The man who built an empire on fear. But here's the thing, none of that mattered when his baby son started crying in the middle of dinner at the city's most expensive restaurant. Guards? Useless. Money? Worthless. That legendary control everyone feared? Gone. Then this woman, Natasha Grant, a Jamaican waitress just trying to make it through her shift, walks up to the most dangerous table in Seoul and does something no one else dared. She touches his child. And just like that, silence. The baby stops crying. The room stops breathing. And Ji-hoon Jung? He stops being invincible. Because for the first time in his life, he realizes there's a power he doesn't have and she does. So what happens when a mafia boss decides you're the solution to his problem? Stick around. This story gets wild. The silence at the Crimson Pearl restaurant wasn't just expensive, it was sacred. Welcome back, beautiful souls. If this is your first time here, welcome. You're about to hear something special. Do me a favor. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And comment below where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing our global family grow. Alright, let's begin. It was the silence of power lunches, backroom deals, and blood debts settled over Wagyu beef. It was the kind of silence that cost $500,000 per table. And tonight, that silence belonged entirely to Ji-hoon Jung. At 31 years old, Ji-hoon was a study in controlled elegance. Seated in his private corner booth beneath low amber lighting, he cut a lethal figure in his midnight Tom Ford suit. His jet-black hair was swept back with razor precision, revealing a face carved from marble-sharp jawline, cold, dark eyes, and the faintest trace of ink peeking from beneath his collar. A dragon's tail, a symbol of dominance. He was the youngest head of the Jung family syndicate, Seoul's most feared criminal empire. His empire spanned real estate, shipping, nightlife, and shadows so deep the police didn't even whisper his name. He didn't raise his voice to command obedience. A single look could end careers. A whispered order could end lives. But tonight, Ji-hoon Jung was losing. He was losing to a 6-month-old tyrant named Sung-hoon, who currently occupied a designer car seat on the leather banquette beside him. And Sung-hoon wasn't just crying, he was screaming. High-pitched, lung-shredding wails that tore through the restaurant's carefully curated atmosphere like gunfire. Ji-hoon's security detail, 2 towering men named Min-jae and Tae-sung, stood near the entrance, stone-faced and useless. The other diners, CEOs, politicians, old money pretended not to stare, but Ji-hoon could feel their eyes. Every shriek was exposure. Every second of lost control was vulnerability. And vulnerability, in his world, was a death sentence. He'd tried everything. The imported German pacifier, the 300,000 stuffed elephant, the warmed formula prepared by his personal chef, the bouncing technique his late mother-in-law had shown him before she, too, disappeared from his life. Nothing worked. Shh, Sang-hoon-ah, Ji-hoon whispered in Korean, his voice low and gravelly, a voice that had ordered executions now reduced to pleading with an infant. Please, be still. The baby's face was crimson, tears streaming, little fists clenched in furious desperation. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. His exhaustion was a physical weight pressing against his ribs. He was a man who controlled every variable, anticipated every threat. Yet this tiny, chaotic human, his own blood was his greatest weakness. He reached for his phone, ready to signal Min-jae to prepare the emergency exit. That's when he felt it. A shift in the air. A presence. Too close. His head snapped up, instincts sharpened to lethal readiness, hand hovering near the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Standing beside his table, violating the invisible 3-meter perimeter his men enforced, was a waitress. She was breathtaking, not in the delicate, high-maintenance way of the socialites who orbited his world, but with a raw, grounded beauty that seemed to absorb the chaos around her. Her skin was deep brown, glowing like warm earth under the amber lights. Her hair was pulled into neat, intricate braids that framed a face of profound calm. She wore the restaurant's simple uniform, a black dress with a white collar, but she carried herself with quiet strength that demanded attention. Her name tag read, Natasha. Ji-hoon's gaze turned sharp, calculating, dangerous. Waitstaff at the Crimson Pearl were trained to be invisible ghosts who served and vanished. This woman was making direct, steady eye contact. With his son, I will need the check now, Ji-hoon said coldly, his voice edged with warning. He didn't like proximity. He didn't like the pity, or was it understanding? In her warm brown eyes, Natasha didn't flinch. She kept her gaze on Sang-hoon, who was trembling with the effort of his cries. He's not hungry, sir, she said. Her voice was low, melodic, rich with a lilting Jamaican accent that somehow cut through the noise and landed squarely in Ji-hoon's chest. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't fearful. It simply stated truth, like observing rain. Ji-hoon's frown deepened. He was fed 25 minutes ago. Precise measurements. Correct temperature. Natasha shook her head just slightly. Just enough. She lowered herself with fluid grace until she was eye level with the distressed baby. Her movements unhurried, deliberate, respectful. "He's not asking for milk, sir," she murmured softly, as if speaking to Sang-hoon alone. "He's asking for your heartbeat, for the rhythm he knew before the world got loud." Before Ji-hoon could process the audacity, the boldness of this stranger telling him what his own son needed, Natasha did the unthinkable. She reached out. Min-jae moved instantly, one hand inside his jacket. But Ji-hoon raised a single finger, a command to stop. Curiosity, sharp and sudden, held him frozen. Natasha's hand, long, elegant fingers, the color of rich mahogany, settled gently on Sang-hoon's tiny, rigid back. It wasn't a pat, it wasn't a shake, it was an anchor, firm, warm, steady, and then she began to hum. It wasn't a lullaby, it wasn't a melody. It was two notes, low, resonant, rhythmic, repeated in a pattern so slow and deliberate it felt less like music and more like a pulse, like the deep, steady drumming of an adult heart. The effect was instant. Sang-hoon's screams didn't fade. They stopped, severed, like a wire cut clean. His rigid body melted. His wide, panicked eyes drifted toward Natasha's face, tracking the soft movement of her lips. A final, shuddering sob hiccuped in his chest, and then silence. He began to mouth the air, his tiny fists uncurling into soft pink petals. The silence that returned to the crimson pearl was deeper, heavier than before. It wasn't the silence of wealth and exclusivity. It was the stunned silence of the impossible made real. Ji-hoon felt his shoulders lock tight for hours, drop an inch. The tension braided into his neck unwound in one dizzying, disorienting rush. He stared, completely blindsided. The most powerful man in Seoul had been defeated by his own child and saved by a woman whose name he hadn't known 10 seconds ago. Natasha looked up, her expression serene, though her eyes held a glimmer of quiet amusement that somehow challenged his authority without a single word. She rubbed Sang-hoon's back once more, ensuring he was settled, then began to straighten, returning to the invisible role she was paid for. "He just needs to know someone is steady, sir," she said softly, her smile gentle but knowing. Ji-hoon cleared his throat, the sound rough, foreign in his own mouth. "Wait." Natasha paused, turning back. "Your name is Natasha," Ji-hoon stated, his voice returning to its characteristic low command. "You have experience with children?" "I have younger siblings, sir," she replied simply, "and a good ear." "How did you know?" he pressed. "How did you know he wanted the heartbeat, not the bottle?" Natasha's gaze flicked briefly to the jade pendant Ji-hoon wore beneath his collar, a gift from his late wife, then back to his eyes. The gesture felt intimate, invasive, and yet respectful. "The world is very loud for someone so small," she said. "Sometimes the only thing that makes sense is the beat you heard before you were born." He needed to be grounded. She delivered the answer like a doctor diagnosing a simple illness. Logical, profound, devastatingly accurate. "Thank you," Ji-hoon managed a word he rarely had to use. It felt heavy on his tongue, like admitting defeat. Natasha gave him a small, polite nod, and then as swiftly and silently as she had appeared, she vanished back into the dim corners of the dining room. Ji-hoon looked down at Sang-hoon. The baby was now sleeping soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Ji-hoon gently touched his son's back, trying to recreate the magic of Natasha's touch, but it was just his own anxious hand. The rhythm was wrong. He picked up his phone. He didn't call Min-jae or Tae-sung. He called Kang Dae, his chief of intelligence, a man who specialized in finding information that didn't want to be found. "I need a complete file," Ji-hoon ordered, his voice suddenly sharp with renewed focus, exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "A waitress at the Crimson Pearl. Name, Hyung-nim?" Dae's voice was deferential, efficient. Ji-hoon looked at the napkin he'd instinctively taken from Natasha's tray, where a drop of spilled water had caught her name in elegant cursive script. "Natasha Grant," he said slowly, testing the weight of it. The name felt potent. A solution to a problem he hadn't known how to solve. "And Dae? Make it fast. She's going to solve a lot more than just tonight." He ended the call and sat back, his gaze lingering on the doorway where she'd disappeared. For the first time in years, Ji-hoon Jung felt something he didn't recognize. Peace. And he would do anything to keep it. Okay. Pause for a second. Can we talk about how bold Natasha is, walking up to a literal mafia boss like that? If you're loving this story so far, do me a favor. Smash that like button and drop a comment telling me, would you have approached that table? Be honest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, this story gets intense. Alright, let's keep going. Natasha Grant didn't notice the shadow that followed her through the staff exit of the Crimson Pearl. She was too exhausted to notice much of anything. It was 11:47 p.m., and her feet ached in her worn black flats. She'd just worked a double shift, lunch service and dinner, and all she wanted was to collapse on her lumpy futon and sleep for exactly 5 hours before her morning shift at the cafe started. She pulled her jacket tighter against Seoul's November chill and headed toward the subway station 3 blocks away, her breath forming small clouds in the neon-lit air. Behind her, maintaining a precise 20-meter distance, Kang Dae moved like smoke. Ji-hoon's right-hand man was a ghost when he needed to be 6 feet of lean muscle wrapped in a black overcoat, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He wasn't there to threaten, just to observe, to confirm what the file couldn't tell them, who Natasha Grant really was when she thought no one was watching. Back inside the restaurant, the kitchen staff was buzzing. "Did you see that?" whispered Min Seo, one of the younger servers, as she scrubbed wine glasses with frantic energy. Natasha walked right up to Ji-hoon Jung's table. The Ji-hoon Jung. "She's either the bravest woman in Seoul or the stupidest," muttered Chef Park, a grizzled man who'd worked at the Crimson Pearl for 15 years. He lowered his voice. "You know what they say about him, right? His enemies don't just disappear. They're erased. No bodies. No evidence. Just gone." Min Seo's eyes widened, but she calmed his baby. "I saw the whole thing." The kid stopped crying the second she touched him. "Doesn't matter," Chef Park said grimly. "Men like that don't forget. If he noticed her, she's already in his world. And once you're in," he dragged a finger across his throat. Min Seo shivered. "Should we warn her?" Chef Park shook his head slowly. "It's already too late." Natasha's apartment was in Guro District, a 40-minute subway ride from Gangnam's glittering towers. It was the kind of neighborhood where laundry hung from every balcony, where street vendors sold tteokbokki from carts, and where people worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. She climbed 4 flights of narrow stairs to apartment 402, her keys jingling as she unlocked the 3 separate deadbolts. The door creaked open to reveal a tiny, cluttered space that somehow still felt like home. The living room, kitchen, and dining area were all one room. A small TV flickered in the corner, playing a late-night drama on mute. On the threadbare couch, her 15-year-old sister Aaliyah was asleep, textbooks still open across her lap. Natasha smiled softly and draped a blanket over her sister's shoulders. Aaliyah was brilliant honor roll, scholarship track, everything Natasha had hoped for her. But brilliance didn't pay rent. "Natasha? That you, baby?" The voice came from the bedroom, weak, thready, but warm. Natasha moved through the beaded curtain that separated the sleeping area. Her mother, Claudette Grant, lay propped on pillows, an oxygen tube beneath her nose. At 53, she looked 70. Chronic heart disease and diabetes had ravaged her body, but her eyes, the same warm brown as Natasha's, still held that fierce Caribbean fire. "Yes, Mama," Natasha whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. She took her mother's hand, so thin now, the bones like bird wings beneath papery skin. "How are you feeling?" "I'm all right, darling. Don't you worry about me." Claudette squeezed her daughter's hand. "You work too hard, Tasha. You're going to burn out." "I'm fine, Mama." Natasha forced brightness into her voice. "Just 2 more semesters, and I'll have my nursing degree. Then things will get easier." Claudette's eyes clouded with guilt. "I hate that you gave up your scholarship to take care of me. You should be living in a dorm, going to parties, being young." "Mama, stop." Natasha's voice was gentle but firm. "You and Aaliyah are my priority. Always. We're going to be fine." But even as she said it, Natasha felt the weight of the lie. The medical bills were drowning them. Her mother's new medication cost $800,000 per month, money they didn't have. She'd already deferred her tuition payment twice. One more deferment and she'd lose her spot in the nursing program entirely. She kissed her mother's forehead. "Get some rest. I'll check on you in the morning before work." Natasha retreated to the corner of the living room where her bedroom consisted of a folding screen and a futon. She changed into an oversized t-shirt, set her alarm for 5:30 a.m., and closed her eyes. She didn't dream of the Mafia boss with the cold eyes and the crying baby. She dreamed of drowning in paperwork stamped overdue in red ink. The knock came at 9:15 a.m. Natasha had just returned from her morning cafe shift, exhausted and desperately craving coffee. Aaliyah was at school. Her mother was sleeping. The knock was firm, polite, but somehow final, like the sound of a door closing rather than opening. Natasha's stomach clenched. Landlords didn't knock like that. Bill collectors didn't knock like that. She peered through the peephole and froze. A man stood in the hallway, tall, lean, dressed in an impeccable black suit that probably cost more than 6 months of her rent. His face was sharp, handsome in a dangerous way, with cold eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He stood with the stillness of a predator. He was looking directly at the peephole, as if he knew she was watching. Natasha's hand trembled as she opened the door just a crack. The chain still latched. "Miss Natasha Grant?" The man's voice was smooth, polite, but it carried an undercurrent of absolute authority. He spoke English with a slight accent, each word precisely chosen. "Who's asking?" Natasha's voice was steadier than she felt. The man reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and produced a business card. It was matte black with silver-embossed text. No company name, just a name and a number. Kang Dae, Executive Security. "My employer would like to extend an invitation," Kang Dae said. "He wishes to thank you personally for your kindness last night." Natasha's mouth went dry. "Your employer?" "Mr. Ji-hoon Jong." Kang Dae's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Respect, or perhaps warning. He doesn't often express gratitude. When he does, it's significant. "I'm working a double shift today," Natasha said quickly. "I don't have time for—" "Your shifts have been covered," Kang Dae interrupted smoothly. "Mr. Jung has already compensated the Crimson Pearl for your absence. A car is waiting downstairs." Fear spiked through Natasha's chest. "I didn't agree to anything." Kang Dae's expression softened just slightly, just enough to seem almost human. "Miss Grant, Mr. Jung is not a man who issues threats. He is simply accustomed to being accommodated. It would be unwise to decline. And if I do?" The silence stretched between them like a blade. "He doesn't like to ask twice," Kang Dae said quietly. It wasn't a threat, it was a forecast. A glimpse of a future Natasha suddenly understood she couldn't avoid. "Give me 5 minutes," she whispered. The car was a black Genesis G90 with windows tinted so dark they looked like sheets of obsidian. Natasha sat in the back seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Kang Dae drove in silence. They left Guro behind, crossing the Han River into Gangnam. The buildings grew taller, sleeker, impossibly expensive. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a glass tower that seemed to pierce the sky. Kang Dae led her to a private elevator. It required both a keycard and a fingerprint scan. They ascended in silence 30 floors, 40, 50 until the numbers stopped at P. Penthouse. The elevator doors opened directly into an apartment that defied comprehension. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sprawling cityscape of Seoul. The interior was all clean lines, dark wood, marble surfaces, and art that Natasha suspected cost more than her entire neighborhood. Everything was controlled, minimalist, powerful. And standing by the windows, backlit by the afternoon sun, was Ji-hoon Jong. He'd changed from his restaurant suit into something more casual: black slacks, a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing the intricate tattoos that snaked up his forearms. He looked younger in the daylight, more human, but no less dangerous. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, something like surprise crossed his face, as if he hadn't expected her to actually come. "Miss Grant." He gestured to a leather chair across from a glass coffee table. "Please, sit." Natasha sat, her spine straight, her hands folded. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she'd grown up in Kingston, Jamaica. She knew when running would only make you pray. Ji-hoon sat across from her, his movements precise and elegant. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his dark eyes searching for something she couldn't name. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what you did last night, for my son." "You're welcome," Natasha said carefully. "But you didn't need to bring me here just to say that." A ghost of a smile touched Ji-hoon's lips. "No, I didn't." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim white envelope. He placed it on the table between them and slid it across the glass surface with 2 fingers. Natasha stared at it like it might explode. "Open it," Ji-hoon said softly. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the envelope. Inside was a certified bank check. Her eyes scanned the numbers once, then again, certain she'd misread. Kenza, 000, 15 million won, nearly $10,000. Her vision blurred. She looked up at Ji-hoon, her voice barely a whisper. This is too much. I just calmed your baby. I didn't. You gave me something I haven't had in 6 months. Ji-hoon interrupted, his voice low and intense. Peace. That's worth far more than money. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. I have a proposition for you, Miss Grant, and I suggest you consider it very carefully. Natasha's heart hammered against her ribs. I want you to be my son's private caretaker. The world tilted. And in that moment, Natasha Grant realized that the door she'd walked through couldn't be walked back out of. The wolf had already decided. She was his. The envelope sat between them like a loaded gun. Natasha's fingers trembled as she set it back down on the glass table, the check still visible through the translucent paper. 15 million. More money than she'd see in a year. Maybe 2. A caretaker, she repeated slowly, her voice careful, measured. For how long? As long as my son needs you. Ji-hoon's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing a business acquisition, which, if last night is any indication, could be quite some time. He stood, moving to a sleek bar cart near the window. Without asking, he poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter not presumptuous enough to offer alcohol, but commanding enough to control even this small gesture of hospitality. He placed 1 glass in front of Natasha, then reclaimed his seat. The terms are simple, Ji-hoon continued. You will live on my estate in a private suite. Your responsibilities center entirely on Sang-hoon's well-being, feeding, care, emotional stability. You will have access to anything you need. Supplies, medical resources, education materials. He paused, his dark eyes fixed on hers. Your compensation will be 100 million annually. Natasha choked on the water she'd just sipped. I'm sorry, what? 100 million won per year, Ji-hoon repeated calmly. Approximately 75,000 US dollars, plus benefits, housing, meals, security, and a separate stipend for your family's needs. The number was so absurd, so impossibly large, that Natasha's mind couldn't process it. That was more than her mother's medical bills, more than Alia's school expenses, more than rent, food, and her deferred tuition combined with enough left over to actually save something. There are conditions, of course, Ji-hoon added, his voice dropping slightly. You will not leave the estate without clearance. All communication with outside parties must be monitored for security purposes. Your personal phone will be replaced with a secure device. You will not discuss my business, my family, or anything you see or hear within my home. And there it was. The cage, gilded and beautiful, but a cage nonetheless. Natasha set the glass down with a sharp clink. So, I'd be a prisoner. You'd be protected, Ji-hoon corrected smoothly. There's a difference. Not from where I'm sitting. Natasha stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. Her voice was steady, but fire burned beneath it. Mr. Jung, I appreciate the offer, I really do. But I'm not for sale. I have a life, a family, a future that doesn't involve being locked in some mansion playing nanny to a stranger's child. Ji-hoon didn't move. He simply watched her with those unreadable dark eyes, as if he'd anticipated this exact reaction and found it amusing. Sit down, Miss Grant. It wasn't a request. The command in his voice was so absolute, so devoid of room for negotiation, that Natasha found herself sinking back into the chair before her mind could override her body's instinct to obey. Ji-hoon leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow more dangerous. Let me tell you what I know, he said softly. Your mother, Claudette Grant, 53 years old, suffers from congestive heart failure and type 2 diabetes. Her medication costs $800,000 per month, medication you can barely afford. You've been rationing her prescriptions for the past 3 months, which is why her condition is worsening. Natasha's blood turned to ice. Your sister, Alia, is 15, brilliant student. She's been accepted into the International School of Seoul's scholarship program, but you'll need to provide $5 million in fees by December, or she loses her spot. Ji-hoon's gaze never wavered. You work 3 jobs, the Crimson Pearl, a cafe in Guro, and weekend tutoring. You sleep an average of 4 hours per night. You've deferred your nursing school tuition twice. 1 more deferment, and you're expelled from the program. Each sentence landed like a physical blow. Natasha's hands clenched into fists in her lap, her nails biting into her palms. How dare you? I dare, because I need to understand who I'm entrusting with my son's life, Ji-hoon interrupted, his voice still maddeningly calm. And what I understand, Miss Grant, is that you are drowning. You're strong, resourceful, and selfless, but you're sinking, and no amount of willpower will change that. He slid a folder across the table. Natasha opened it with shaking hands. Inside were copies of medical bills, tuition statements, rental agreements, every piece of her private financial hell laid bare in black and white. You need stability, Ji-hoon said quietly. My son needs peace. We can trade. This isn't a trade, Natasha whispered, her voice breaking. This is blackmail. This is reality. Ji-hoon's expression softened barely, but enough to seem almost human. I'm not your enemy, Natasha. I'm offering you a way out. Natasha looked up at him, tears burning behind her eyes but refusing to fall. And what happens when you decide you don't need me anymore? When Sang-hoon grows up, or you find someone else, what happens to me then? For the first time, something flickered in Ji-hoon's eyes. Respect, perhaps. Or recognition. Then you'll leave with enough money to finish your degree, buy your mother a house, and give your sister the future she deserves, he said. I don't discard people who serve me well, Miss Grant. I reward them. The penthouse was silent except for the distant hum of the city below. Natasha closed the folder, closed her eyes, and felt the weight of the choice, crushing her chest. I need time to think, she whispered. Ji-hoon nodded. You have until tomorrow. Kang Dae will take you home. Natasha didn't make it through the door before her phone rang. The number was Aaliyah's, but the voice on the other end was a neighbor's, panicked, breathless, terrified. Natasha, you need to come home right now. It's your mother. She collapsed. The ambulance is here. The world tilted. Natasha's phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the marble floor. Ji-hoon was beside her in an instant, his hand on her elbow, steadying her. What happened? His voice was sharp, commanding. My mother, Natasha couldn't breathe. She collapsed. I have to go. Ji-hoon was already moving. He barked orders in rapid Korean to Kang Dae, who appeared in seconds. Then Ji-hoon turned back to Natasha, his expression hard but not unkind. Which hospital? I don't know yet, It doesn't matter. Ji-hoon's hand was still on her arm, grounding her through the panic. I'll find out. Go. Dae will drive you. I'll handle everything else. I can't afford. I'll handle it, Ji-hoon repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Go to your mother. Now. It was 2 a.m. when Natasha finally saw her. Claudette Grant was stable barely. The doctors said she'd suffered a severe cardiac event. She needed immediate surgery, followed by months of intensive care and rehabilitation. The cost estimate sat on the nurse's desk like a death sentence. $35 million. Natasha sat in the sterile waiting room, her head in her hands, Aaliyah asleep against her shoulder. She didn't know how long she'd been crying. Then Kang Dae appeared in the doorway, silent as a ghost. The bills have been covered, he said simply. All of them. Surgery, recovery, medication, follow-up care. Mr. Jung has arranged for a private room and the best cardiac team in Seoul. Natasha looked up, her face wet with tears. Why? Kang Dae's expression was unreadable. Because he keeps his promises. He placed a manila folder on the chair beside her. Inside was a contract 10 pages, legal and binding. At the bottom, a line for her signature. He said you'd know what to do. 3 days later, Natasha stood in Ji-hoon's penthouse once more. The contract was signed, notarized, irreversible. Her mother was recovering in a suite that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. Aaliyah's school fees were paid in full, and Natasha Grant no longer belonged to herself. Ji-hoon accepted the contract without fanfare. He glanced at her signature, then set it aside. When he looked at her, his expression was calm, satisfied but not smug. You made the right choice, he said quietly. Did I? Natasha's voice was hollow. Ji-hoon stepped closer, his presence overwhelming but no longer threatening. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle. You calm chaos, Miss Grant. He extended his hand, a gesture of partnership, not ownership. From now on, chaos belongs to me. Natasha stared at his hand for a long moment. Then, with the weight of her family's survival on her shoulders, she took it. The deal was done. The cage door closed, and somewhere in the mansion, a baby began to cry. The Jung estate didn't feel like a home. It felt like a mausoleum. Natasha's first glimpse came through the tinted windows of the Genesis as they passed through the iron gates. The mansion rose before her like a fortress, 3 stories of white stone and dark glass, surrounded by manicured gardens so perfect they looked artificial. Everything was symmetrical, controlled, lifeless, beautiful, and utterly cold. Kang Dae led her through the front entrance, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The foyer was a cathedral of wealth, a crystal chandelier the size of a car, walls lined with abstract art, a sweeping staircase that curved upward like a spine, and silence. Oppressive, suffocating silence. Staff members moved through the halls like shadows, maids in black uniforms, security personnel in tactical gear, all of them avoiding eye contact. They didn't speak. They barely breathed. It was as if the house itself demanded silence. "Your quarters," Kangdae said, stopping before a door on the second floor's east wing. The suite was larger than Natasha's entire apartment. A bedroom with a king-sized bed, a sitting area with plush furniture, a bathroom with marble counters and a soaking tub. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the garden. Everything was cream, white, and gray, elegant and soulless. "The nursery is across the hall," Kangdae continued. "Mr. Jung's private wing is on the third floor. You are not to enter without permission. Meals are served at set times, or you may request room service." "Any questions?" Natasha turned slowly, taking in the gilded cage. "Where's Sang-hoon now?" "With the day nanny. She'll brief you before her shift ends at 6 p.m. Kangdae's expression softened barely. "Welcome to the Jung household, Miss Grant." Then he left, closing the door with a soft final click. Natasha sat on the edge of the impossibly soft bed and tried not to feel like she'd just been buried alive. The nursery was as cold as the rest of the house. Natasha stepped inside at 5:45 p.m. to find a woman in her 50s, Mrs. Choi, the head nanny, pacing with Sang-hoon in her arms. The baby was screaming, his face red and tear-streaked, his little fists flailing. Mrs. Choi looked exhausted, terrified even. "He won't eat," she said in heavily accented English, her voice tight with stress. "He won't sleep. He only cries. Always cries." She glanced nervously toward the doorway, as if expecting Ji-hoon to materialize and punish her for her failure. Natasha stepped forward, arms extended. "May I?" Mrs. Choi hesitated, then practically shoved the baby into Natasha's arms before fleeing the room like it was on fire. The moment Sang-hoon settled against Natasha's chest, his cries faltered. She began the same low, rhythmic hum from the restaurant, swaying gently side to side. Within 30 seconds, the baby's sobs dissolved into hiccups. Within a minute, he was silent, his tiny fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater. Natasha looked down at him, this small, helpless thing, who'd lost his mother and been surrounded by people too afraid to truly hold him. "Hey, little man," she whispered in patois. "Yuh, safe now, yuh hear? Mina, go leave yuh." Sang-hoon's dark eyes, so much like his father's, blinked up at her. And for the first time, his tiny mouth curved into something almost like a smile. Natasha felt her heart crack open. The first 3 days were tense. Ji-hoon was everywhere and nowhere. Natasha never saw him directly, but she felt him. Security cameras tracked her movements. Staff reported to him. And twice, she caught glimpses of him standing in shadowed doorways, watching her with Sang-hoon, his expression unreadable. It was unnerving, invasive, like being studied by a predator deciding whether to strike. But Natasha refused to shrink. She filled the nursery with warmth. She opened the curtains to let sunlight flood the room. She brought in soft blankets with bright colors, yellow, coral, teal, ignoring Mrs. Choi's protests that Mr. Jung prefers neutral tones. She played music from her phone, reggae, calypso, Motown, anything with soul and rhythm. And she sang, not softly, not apologetically. She sang lullabies her grandmother had taught her, songs her mother had hummed while cooking, melodies that carried the warmth of Kingston's sun and the crash of its waves. The house, so long silent, began to breathe. Sang-hoon responded immediately. He started eating without fussing. He slept through the night, and he smiled not once, but constantly, his whole face lighting up whenever Natasha entered the room. He never smiled. Mrs. Choi admitted one afternoon, her voice awed. "Not since the mistress passed. 6 months, and nothing. But he smiles for you." Natasha kissed the baby's forehead. He just needed to feel safe. Even the staff began to change. Min Jae, one of Ji-hoon's stone-faced guards, started nodding politely when Natasha passed him in the hall. Young-suk, the head housekeeper, began leaving fresh flowers in Natasha's room. And one evening, Natasha found Chef Lim, a stern man who never spoke, had prepared jerk chicken for dinner without being asked. "My grandmother was Jamaican," he said gruffly when Natasha thanked him. "I remember the smell. Thought you might miss it." Natasha's eyes burned with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered. The mansion was still a fortress, but slowly, quietly, it was becoming something else. It was the 7th night when Ji-hoon finally appeared. Natasha was in the nursery, rocking Sang-hoon in the antique chair by the window. The lights were dimmed, and she was humming low, rhythmic, the same two-note melody that had first silenced his cries. She didn't notice Ji-hoon standing in the doorway until she glanced up and saw him. He was dressed down black slacks and a white t-shirt, his hair slightly disheveled, the tattoos on his arms fully visible in the soft light. He looked younger, vulnerable, almost. But his eyes held something raw and aching. Natasha stilled, but she didn't stop humming. Ji-hoon didn't speak. He simply stood there, one shoulder leaning against the doorframe, watching his son's peaceful face. Watching her, the melody continued, filling the space between them. Sang-hoon's breathing deepened, his tiny body going slack in Natasha's arms. She rose slowly, careful not to wake him, and lowered him into the crib. She tucked the soft coral blanket around him, brushed her fingers over his dark hair, and whispered, "Sleep sweet, baby boy." Only then did she turn to face Ji-hoon. "He's down for the night," she said quietly. "He ate well. No fussing." Ji-hoon nodded, but he didn't move. His gaze drifted back to the crib, and something in his expression cracked just for a second. Just enough for Natasha to see the grief beneath the armor. "He smiles now," Ji-hoon said, his voice rough. "Mrs. Choi told me." "Yes," Natasha confirmed, "he does." "He didn't." "Not since," Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Natasha took a step closer, her voice gentle. "He's still here, Mr. Jung. Your son. He's still full of joy. He just needed someone to show him it was safe to feel it." Ji-hoon's eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, the distance between them collapsed. He looked at her not as an employer, not as a mafia boss, but as a man drowning in grief who'd just been thrown a lifeline. "What were you humming?" he asked quietly. "That melody. What is it?" Natasha hesitated. "It's nothing really, just something my grandmother used to hum, a heartbeat rhythm. It reminds babies of the womb, of safety." "It reminds me of something too," Ji-hoon murmured, almost to himself. He closed his eyes briefly, and Natasha saw his shoulders drop, tension he'd been carrying for months finally releasing. "What does it remind you of?" she asked softly. Ji-hoon opened his eyes, and the vulnerability was gone, replaced by his usual controlled mask. But his voice, when he spoke, was still rough around the edges. "Peace," he said simply. "Something I thought I'd lost." He straightened, the moment ending as quickly as it had begun. He gave her a short nod acknowledgement, gratitude, dismissal, and turned to leave. But he paused in the doorway, his back to her. "Keep singing, Miss Grant," he said quietly. "The house. It's been silent for too long." Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Natasha stood alone in the nursery, her heart pounding. She looked down at Sang-hoon, sleeping peacefully in his crib. And she realized, with sudden clarity, that she wasn't just healing the baby, she was healing the man who'd forgotten how to feel. "Listen, my mom told me I'd never hit 1,000 subscribers with these story videos," she said. "Nobody wants to hear you narrate for 20 minutes. Well, Mom, if you're watching this, I'm about to prove you wrong. If you're enjoying this story, help me out. Subscribe, hit that like button, and comment Team Natasha if you think she's brave, or Team Ji-hoon if you think he's about to ruin her life. Let's see which team wins." Now back to the story. The rules came on the 10th day. Ji-hoon summoned Natasha to his study, a room she'd never entered before. All dark wood and leather, with walls lined with books that looked more like weapons than literature. He sat behind an enormous desk, backlit by the morning sun, every inch the crime lord. He didn't ask her to sit. "We need to establish boundaries," Ji-hoon began, his tone clipped and professional. "My household operates on structure, discipline, control. I need you to understand the parameters of your role." Natasha clasped her hands in front of her, her expression neutral. "I'm listening. First, Sang-hoon's schedule must be maintained precisely. Feeding times, nap times, bedtime, all at the designated hours. No deviations." He consulted a document on his desk. "Second, physical contact with my son ceases at 9 p.m. After that hour, he must learn to self-soothe. He cannot become dependent." Natasha's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "Third," Ji-hoon continued, his eyes lifting to meet hers, "your singing and activities are to remain confined to the nursery. The rest of the house must maintain its atmosphere. Fourth, you do not ask questions about my business, my associates, or my movements, ever. And finally," his voice dropped, cold and final, "you do not leave the estate without my explicit permission. for any reason. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Are we clear, Miss Grant?" Natasha met his gaze, unflinching. "Crystal." Ji-hoon nodded, satisfied. "Good. You may go." Natasha turned to leave, but paused at the door. She looked back over her shoulder, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "Mr. Jung? Just so we're clear, I was hired to take care of your son, not to run a military operation." She didn't wait for a response. By day 14, Natasha had broken every single rule. Rule 1. Maintain the schedule. Sang-hoon was hungry at 4:47 p.m., not 5 p.m., so Natasha fed him. He was exhausted at 7:15 p.m., not 8 p.m., so she put him down early. When Mrs. Choi nervously mentioned that Mr. Jung expects precision, Natasha smiled sweetly and said, "Mr. Jung isn't the one caring for a baby." Rule 2. No contact after 9 p.m. The first night Natasha tried to follow this rule, Sang-hoon screamed for 45 minutes straight. She lasted 10 minutes before she walked into the nursery, scooped him up, and held him against her chest until his sobs quieted. She sat in the rocking chair until midnight, humming softly, her hand a steady anchor on his small back. If Ji-hoon's cameras caught her, he said nothing. Rule 3. Singing confined to the nursery. This was the rule Natasha found most absurd. Music wasn't something you confined, it was something you shared. So she hummed while walking the hallways. She sang softly while eating breakfast in the dining room. And one afternoon, while Sang-hoon napped, she sat in the garden and sang an old hymn her grandmother had taught her, her voice carrying through the open windows. Chef Lim, passing by with groceries, paused to listen. When she finished, he nodded once in acknowledgement and continued inside. Rule 4. No questions about his business. Natasha didn't need to ask questions. She had eyes. She saw the men in dark suits arriving at odd hours. She heard raised voices behind closed doors. She noticed the way Ji-hoon returned home some nights with blood on his cuffs, his expression carved from stone. But she never asked. Not because of his rule, but because she'd learned long ago that some answers were more dangerous than ignorance. Rule 5. No leaving the estate. This one, Natasha kept. Not by choice, but by necessity. She had nowhere to go. Her mother was stable, Aaliyah was thriving, and Natasha's world had shrunk to these walls. Still, she opened every window she could find. If she couldn't leave, at least she could let the outside in. The explosion came on day 17. Ji-hoon returned home at 10:43 p.m., exhausted from a meeting that had devolved into thinly veiled threats and posturing. All he wanted was silence. Control. The familiar cold order of his home. Instead, he heard music. Not humming, not soft lullabies. Actual music, a phone playing something rhythmic and joyful, the kind of song that demanded movement. And beneath it, laughter. A baby's laughter, bright and unbridled, echoing through the second-floor hallway. Ji-hoon's blood went cold. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon at his back. The sound was coming from the east wing, from the sitting room adjacent to Natasha's quarters, a space that was supposed to remain pristine and unused. He shoved the door open and stopped dead. Natasha was dancing. She wore soft cotton pants and an oversized t-shirt, her braids loose around her shoulders, her feet bare against the hardwood floor. And in her arms, Sang-hoon was giggling, his whole body shaking with delight as she spun him gently to the beat, dipping and swaying, her movements fluid and full of life. The room had been transformed. The heavy curtains were open, moonlight streaming in. Cushions from the couch were scattered across the floor like a soft playground, and the music, some kind of Caribbean dance hall, pulsed with infectious joy. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Natasha's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. But she didn't stop moving. Sang-hoon was mid-laugh, and she refused to break the moment. "Dancing," she said simply, slightly breathless. "It's nearly 11 o'clock, Ji-hoon bit out, stepping into the room. "He should be asleep. You should be. This room is not." And then Sang-hoon saw his father. The baby's face lit up even brighter, and he let out a shriek of pure delight, reaching both tiny hands toward Ji-hoon. Not in fear, not in uncertainty, in joy. Ji-hoon froze. He hadn't heard his son laugh like that since. He couldn't remember the last time. Natasha, reading his expression, stepped closer. "He had a long nap this afternoon, too much energy for bed. So I figured." She shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. Why fight it? Let him be happy. Sang-hoon reached for his father again, babbling excitedly. "He wants you," Natasha said softly. She held the baby out. Ji-hoon stared at his son, at the pure, uncomplicated happiness on that tiny face, and felt something inside him crack. He took Sang-hoon into his arms. The baby immediately grabbed at Ji-hoon's collar, giggling, his legs kicking with excitement. And Natasha, bold as ever, turned the music down, but didn't turn it off. "Dance with him," she said. "Just sway a little. He loves it." I don't dance," Ji-hoon said stiffly. "You don't have to be good at it. You just have to move." Natasha stepped beside him, demonstrating a gentle sway, a small bounce. "Like this. Feel the rhythm." Ji-hoon felt ridiculous. He felt exposed, but Sang-hoon was looking up at him with those huge dark eyes, smiling so wide his 2 tiny teeth showed, and Ji-hoon swayed, awkwardly at first, stiff and uncertain. But Sang-hoon squealed with delight, and Natasha laughed a warm, genuine sound, and suddenly the ridiculousness didn't matter. For 3 minutes, the most feared man in Seoul danced with his son in a moonlit room while a Jamaican waitress hummed harmony to the music. And for 3 minutes, Ji-hoon Jung forgot what it meant to be a monster. Later, after Sang-hoon finally fell asleep, Ji-hoon found Natasha on the balcony outside her suite. She was wrapped in a cardigan, staring out at the garden, the night air cool against her skin. She didn't turn when he approached, but she didn't seem surprised either. "I broke your rules," she said quietly. "All of them." "Yes," Ji-hoon agreed. He stood beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "You did. Are you going to fire me?" "No." Natasha finally looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. Ji-hoon's expression was unreadable, but his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "He laughed tonight. Because of you. I haven't heard him laugh like that since," he trailed off, his jaw working. "Since his mother." The name hung between them, unspoken but present. "You're calm," Ji-hoon continued, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "Your warmth. It reminds me of something I lost." Natasha turned fully toward him, her voice gentle. "What did you lose?" Ji-hoon's hands gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles white. "The ability to feel anything other than control, or rage, or emptiness." He exhaled slowly. "You walk into a room and everything softens. I don't know how you do it." Natasha was quiet for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, close enough that her shoulder almost brushed his. "Maybe you haven't lost it," she said softly. "Maybe you've just forgotten what it feels like." Ji-hoon turned his head, meeting her eyes. In the moonlight, without his armor, he looked younger, more human. "And if I have?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Natasha smiled, small, sad, hopeful. "Then I'll keep reminding you, until you remember." The night wrapped around them, gentle and patient. And for the first time in 6 months, Ji-hoon Jung felt something other than cold. He felt warm. The first outing happened on a Saturday afternoon. "We're going to the park," Ji-hoon announced, appearing in the nursery doorway dressed in dark jeans and a black cashmere sweater, the most casual Natasha had ever seen him. She looked up from where she was playing with Sang-hoon on the floor, surprise evident on her face. "The park?" "Sang-hoon needs sunlight, fresh air, normal experiences." Ji-hoon's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something almost uncertain in his eyes. "You'll accompany us." It wasn't a request. 20 minutes later, Natasha found herself in the back of the Genesis, with Sang-hoon strapped into his car seat beside her. Ji-hoon sat in the front passenger seat, and trailing behind them were 2 additional black SUVs filled with security personnel. "Is all this really necessary?" Natasha asked, watching the convoy through the rear window. Ji-hoon glanced back at her. "Yes." The park, an exclusive private garden that Ji-hoon had apparently rented out entirely for the afternoon, was beautiful. Autumn leaves covered the walking paths, and the air smelled of pine and earth. Natasha pushed Sang-hoon in a designer stroller while Ji-hoon walked beside them, his hands in his pockets, his expression carefully neutral. But his security formed a perimeter. Men in suits stationed at every entrance, their eyes scanning, their hands near concealed weapons. It felt less like a family outing and more like a military operation. Still, Sang-hoon was delighted. He squealed at every bird, reached for falling leaves, kicked his legs with pure joy, and when Natasha lifted him out to let him feel the grass beneath his tiny hands, Ji-hoon knelt beside them, his expression softening in a way that made Natasha's chest ache. "He's happy," Ji-hoon murmured, watching his son grab fistfuls of grass. "He is," Natasha agreed. "Children need the world, Mr. Jung, not just walls." Ji-hoon's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly. The outings became a pattern. A cafe one afternoon rented out, of course. A bookstore another day, where Natasha picked out children's books with bright illustrations while Ji-hoon stood nearby, his presence keeping the staff at a respectful distance. A quiet beach at dawn, where Sang-hoon touched ocean water for the first time and cried until Natasha sang him calm. But with every outing, Natasha noticed the stares, the whispers, the photos taken from a distance despite Kang Dae's best efforts to intercept them. Who is she? Why is she with Ji-hoon Jung? Is that his child? The rumors spread like wildfire through Seoul's underground. The Mafia king had a woman, a foreign woman, young, beautiful, living in his home. Clearly she wasn't just a nanny, no one believed that. She had to be his mistress, his new obsession. Natasha heard the whispers from the mansion staff, saw the way people looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. She was no longer invisible. She was a target. The dinner happened 3 weeks after the first outing. "You'll accompany me tonight," Ji-hoon informed her that afternoon. "A business dinner. My associates expect to meet you." Natasha's stomach clenched. "I'm not sure that's appropriate." "It's not a request." Ji-hoon's tone left no room for argument. "You're part of my household now. That means you're part of my world, whether you like it or not. Wear something formal. We leave at 7. A dress appeared in her room an hour later, elegant, deep emerald green, with a high neck and long sleeves. Modest but undeniably expensive. Natasha stared at it like it might bite her. The restaurant was even more exclusive than the Crimson Pearl, a private dining room with a single long table, low lighting, and an atmosphere thick with tension and power. 8 men sat around the table when Ji-hoon and Natasha arrived. They were all older, all Korean, all radiating the kind of authority that came from violence and money. Their eyes tracked Natasha like predators assessing prey. Ji-hoon's hand settled on the small of her back, possessive, protective, territorial. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly in Korean before switching to English. "This is Miss Natasha Grant. She cares for my son." The men nodded, their expressions ranging from curious to calculating to barely concealed disdain. Natasha was seated beside Ji-hoon, hyper-aware of every eye on her. The conversation flowed in Korean business talk, veiled threats, negotiations she didn't understand. She sat silently, hands folded in her lap, trying to become invisible. Then Park Tae-min, a man with silver hair and cold eyes seated across from her, switched to English. "So," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "The nanny. How? Exotic." His gaze raked over her. "Tell me, Miss Grant, where did Ji-hoon find you?" The question was laced with mockery, the emphasis on find, suggesting something purchased rather than hired. "At a restaurant," Natasha replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "I was working. His son was crying. I helped." Park chuckled, a sound like gravel. "Ah, a waitress. How? Quaint." He took a sip of his whiskey. "And now you live in his home, care for his child. Very generous arrangement, I imagine." The implication was clear. Natasha felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger, not embarrassment. But before she could respond, she felt it. The shift in Ji-hoon's energy beside her. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ji-hoon set down his glass with deliberate precision. When he spoke, his voice was silk over steel. "Tae-min," he said softly in Korean. Then switched to English for Natasha's benefit, she realized. "You'll apologize. Now." Park's smile faltered. "I meant no offense." "You'll apologize," Ji-hoon repeated, his tone unchanged but somehow more dangerous. "Or we'll discuss your shipping routes. Specifically, the ones you've been running through my ports without proper compensation." The table went silent. Park's face paled. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting to Natasha. "My apologies, Miss Grant. I spoke out of turn." Natasha nodded stiffly, her heart pounding. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. No one else dared speak to her or about her. 3 days later, Kang Dae mentioned in passing that Park Tae-min had withdrawn from a major business venture and left Seoul indefinitely. "Personal reasons," Dae said, his expression blank. Natasha didn't ask what that meant. That night, Natasha found Ji-hoon on the mansion's terrace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the dark gardens. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, stepping beside him. "Do what?" His voice was casual, but she knew better. "Whatever you did to Park Tae-min." Natasha wrapped her arms around herself. "Defending me. I can handle a few insults." Ji-hoon turned to look at her, his expression hard. "No one disrespects what's mine." The possessiveness in his tone made her shiver. "I'm not yours, Mr. Jung. I'm an employee." "You're more than that." Ji-hoon stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You're part of my world now, Natasha. That makes you both protected and vulnerable. Do you understand? I understand that you've painted a target on my back, Natasha shot back, her voice rising. Those men tonight, they didn't see a nanny. They saw a weakness. Your weakness. Then they're fools. Jihoon's jaw tightened. But you're right. You are a weakness. Because you brought something into my world that doesn't belong here. What? Peace. The word sounded almost like an accusation. Jihoon's eyes were dark, conflicted. You brought peace into my world, Natasha. My son laughs now. My house feels alive. And he stopped himself, his hand tightening around the glass. I've forgotten how to function in the cold. Natasha's breath caught. But peace is never free, Jihoon continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. In my world, everything has a price, and the more valuable something is, the higher that price becomes. What are you saying? Natasha asked, though she already knew. She'd known since the moment she signed that contract. Jihoon looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, she saw something raw and almost desperate in his eyes. I'm saying that by keeping you here, I've made you a target. My enemies will see you as leverage. My allies will see you as a temptation. And He stopped, turned away. I can't let you go, because my son needs you. And He didn't finish. But Natasha heard the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. I need you too. The night pressed in around them, heavy with danger, and something neither of them dared name. Then protect me, Natasha said finally, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. If I'm part of your world now, if there's no going back, then keep me safe. Jihoon turned back to her, his expression hardening into something resolute and fierce. I will, he said. I'll burn down anyone who tries to touch you. It was a promise, and a threat, and Natasha realized, with a clarity that stole her breath, that she believed him completely. She just wasn't sure if that made her safer or damned. Jihoon left at 9:47 p.m. Stay inside, he told Natasha, his tone clipped and urgent. He was dressed in all black, his jaw tight, his eyes harder than she'd ever seen them. Don't open the door for anyone except Kang Dae. Understand? What's happening? Natasha asked, Sung-hoon drowsy in her arms. Business. Jihoon's hand moved to the weapon at his hip, a gesture that had become familiar but never less unsettling. A problem that needs handling. I'll be back before midnight. He paused in the doorway, looking back at her. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face. Keep him safe, he said quietly. Always, Natasha promised. She didn't know those would be the last normal words they'd speak for hours. The power went out at 10:23 p.m. Natasha was in the nursery, rocking Sung-hoon through a fussy moment, humming softly. The lights died mid-note, plunging the room into complete darkness. The hum of the air conditioning cut out. The soft glow of the baby monitor vanished. Total silence. Total darkness. Natasha's heart kicked against her ribs. It's okay, baby, she whispered, though her voice shook. Just a power outage. It's okay. But then she heard it. Shouting. Distant but growing closer. Men's voices barking commands in Korean. And beneath that, something that made her blood turn to ice. Gunfire. Sharp cracks echoing through the mansion, followed by the crash of breaking glass. Sang-hoon started to whimper, sensing her fear. Natasha's survival instinct, honed from growing up in Kingston's roughest neighborhoods, snapped into focus. She didn't freeze. She didn't panic. She moved. She grabbed the baby carrier from the corner, strapped Sang-hoon against her chest with shaking hands, and yanked the emergency flashlight from the nursery drawer. Her mind raced. The door? No, whoever was coming would check there first. The window? Third story. No escape. Hide. Her eyes landed on the antique bookshelf against the far wall, the one Mrs. Choi had mentioned was original to the house, built with old-fashioned craftsmanship. Natasha had noticed weeks ago that it sat slightly forward from the wall, leaving a gap. She shoved at the bookshelf. It didn't budge. More gunfire. Closer now. A scream cut short. Move, Natasha hissed, throwing her weight against the wood. The bookshelf shifted just slightly, revealing a narrow crawl space behind it, barely 3 feet wide. Some kind of storage alcove or old servant's passage. It would have to be enough. Natasha squeezed through the gap, pulling the bookshelf back as much as she could from the inside. The space was cramped, dusty, pitch black. She crouched low, pressing her back against the cold wall, one hand cradling Sang-hoon's head, the other covering his mouth gently. The baby was crying now, sharp. terrified wails that would give them away in seconds. Natasha began to hum. Low, steady, the same two-note rhythm that had first calmed him in the restaurant. The heartbeat melody. Mm-mm, mm-mm, mm-mm. Sang-hoon's cries faltered, confused by the familiar sound in the midst of chaos. Natasha kept humming, even as her whole body trembled, even as she heard footsteps thundering through the hallway outside, even as the nursery door slammed open. "Clear the room!" a voice barked in Korean. Footsteps, heavy boots on hardwood, the sound of drawers being yanked open, furniture overturned. Natasha pressed deeper into the shadows, her hand gentle but firm over Sang-hoon's mouth. The baby's eyes were wide, staring up at her in the darkness. "Shh, baby, shh, I've got you." She kept humming, barely audible now, her lips against his tiny ear. Mm-mm, mm-mm. The footsteps paused, right in front of the bookshelf. Natasha's heart stopped. "Please, please don't move it. Please." A voice crackled over a radio. "Target's not here. Boss says burn it. We move in 3 minutes." The footsteps retreated. The door slammed shut. Natasha didn't move, didn't breathe. She just kept humming, kept rocking, kept Sang-hoon pressed against her racing heart. And slowly, miraculously, the baby's breathing deepened. His eyes fluttered closed. He fell asleep, in a crawl space, in the dark, while gunfire echoed through his home, because Natasha Grant refused to let him feel anything but safe. Ji-hoon knew something was wrong the moment his phone went dead. He was 15 minutes from the estate, just finishing the execution of the traitor who'd sold his security schedules to the Seo syndicate. The man's blood was still warm on Ji-hoon's hands when every line of communication cut out simultaneously. No, he didn't need confirmation. He knew. "Drive," he snarled at Min-jae. "Now." They reached the estate in 8 minutes, a drive that should have taken 20. The front gates were blown open. Bodies of his guards scattered across the driveway. Smoke poured from the east wing, and at least 6 vehicles he didn't recognize were parked in his circular drive. The Seo syndicate had declared war, and they'd brought it to his home. Ji-hoon was out of the car before it fully stopped, weapon drawn, his face a mask of lethal fury. He moved through his own mansion like a ghost of death, silent and efficient. Every enemy he encountered died. A shot to the head, a blade to the throat. No hesitation, no mercy. His security team rallied behind him those who'd survived, and together they pushed through the chaos. But Ji-hoon's mind was a loop of one singular thought. Sang-hoon, Natasha, the nursery. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in combat. The second-floor hallway was a war zone, bullet holes in the walls, shattered glass, blood smeared across marble. The nursery door was ajar. Ji-hoon hit it at a full sprint, weapon raised, prepared for the worst. The room was destroyed. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, the crib tipped on its side. But no bodies. No blood. "Natasha!" His voice was raw, desperate, a sound he'd never made before. Silence. His knees nearly buckled. He'd failed. He'd failed his son, failed the one person who'd brought light back into his world. Failed. Mm-mm. Mm-mm. Ji-hoon froze. It was so soft he almost missed it. A sound beneath the ringing in his ears. A hum. That melody. His head whipped toward the bookshelf. "Natasha?" His voice cracked. The humming stopped. Then, quietly. "Ji-hoon?" He was across the room in a second, shoving the heavy bookshelf aside with strength born of desperation. And there, crammed in the narrow crawlspace, covered in dust, her eyes wide and wet with tears, was Natasha, alive, with Sang-hoon sleeping peacefully against her chest. Ji-hoon couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. He dropped to his knees in front of the gap, his hands reaching for them, trembling. "Are you hurt?" His voice was hoarse. "I'm okay," Natasha whispered. "We're okay." But she wasn't. Ji-hoon saw it now, blood on her temple where she must have hit her head squeezing into the space. Her arms were scraped raw. And her hands, God, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the baby. "Give him to me," Ji-hoon said gently. Natasha shook her head, clutching Sang-hoon tighter. I can't let go. Natasha." Ji-hoon's hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You're safe now. I'm here. Let me take him." Her resistance crumbled. She let Ji-hoon carefully lift Sang-hoon from the carrier. The baby didn't even wake, and then Ji-hoon reached back in and pulled her out. The moment she was free, Natasha's legs gave out. Ji-hoon caught her, wrapping his free arm around her, holding both of them against his chest. "You saved him," he whispered into her hair. his voice breaking. You saved my son. Natasha's breath came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline finally crashing. I just kept humming. I didn't know what else to do. You did everything right. Ji-hoon pulled back just enough to look at her face, bloodied, terrified, but alive. You were perfect. Kang Dae appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. Hyung-nim, we need to move. The fire. Get them to the safe house, Ji-hoon ordered, his voice steel again. Now. He handed Sang-hoon to Dae with visible reluctance, then scooped Natasha into his arms. She was too exhausted to protest. As they moved through the burning mansion, Natasha looked up at Ji-hoon's face, streaked with ash and blood, his jaw set with lethal purpose. Your home, she whispered, can be rebuilt. Ji-hoon's eyes met hers, and they were blazing with something fierce and unbreakable. You can't. And in that moment, Natasha understood with perfect clarity. She was no longer just the nanny. She was his to protect, at any cost. The safe house was a penthouse across the city, smaller than the mansion, but no less fortified. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Han River, and the pre-dawn sky was beginning to bruise purple at the edges. Natasha sat on a leather couch in the living room, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a paramedic cleaning the cut on her temple. Sang-hoon was in her lap, still sleeping, his tiny fist curled into her shirt. She hadn't let him go. Across the room, Ji-hoon stood with Kang Dae and 3 other senior members of his organization, their voices low and clipped as they discussed logistics. Casualties, retaliation, the names of the dead. 12 of Ji-hoon's men had been killed. The CO syndicate had sent 20 attackers. All 20 were now corpses. The war had been swift, brutal, and far from over. But every few seconds, Ji-hoon's eyes would drift back to Natasha, to the white bandage now taped to her forehead, to the scratches on her arms, to the way she held his son like a lifeline. Hyung-nim. Kang Dae's voice pulled him back. We need decisions. The CO family will expect a response by morning. Then they'll get one, Ji-hoon said coldly. Assemble the captains. I want every SO asset identified and neutralized within 72 hours. No mercy, no exceptions. Dae nodded and moved to make calls. Ji-hoon dismissed the others with a wave of his hand, then crossed the room to where Natasha sat. The paramedic finished his work and quietly excused himself. For a long moment, Ji-hoon just stood there, staring down at her. His suit was torn and blood-stained. Ash streaked his face. His hands, always so controlled, so steady, were trembling. The medic said you'll be fine, he said quietly. Minor concussion, bruising. Nothing serious. I'm okay, Natasha said, though her voice was hollow with exhaustion. Ji-hoon slowly lowered himself to his knees in front of her, a position of vulnerability she'd never seen him take. He was eye level with her now, his expression raw and unguarded. You stayed, he whispered. When the attack came, you could have run. You could have left him and saved yourself. The window, the hallways, you had options. Natasha looked at him confused. Why would I run? Because staying meant you could die. Ji-hoon's voice cracked on the last word. You're not his mother. You're not bound to him by blood. You had every reason to prioritize your own survival. Natasha's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at Sang-hoon, brushing a hand over his soft hair. He needed to know someone was steady, she said simply. That's all. If I'd run, he would have felt it, the fear, the abandonment. He would have screamed, and they would have found him. Her voice broke. So I stayed. I hummed. And I made sure the only thing he felt was safe. Ji-hoon's breath shuddered out of him. He reached forward, slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his hand closed gently around hers, the same hand that had first touched Sang-hoon in the restaurant, the hand that had hummed life back into a house of death, the hand that had shielded his son in the darkness. You saved him, Ji-hoon said, his voice barely audible. You saved the only thing in this world that matters to me. A tear slipped down Natasha's cheek. He matters to me too. Ji-hoon's thumb traced over her knuckles, a gesture so tender, so unlike the man who'd built an empire on violence, that it shattered something fundamental inside him. All his life, he'd believed in control, in power, in the ability to bend the world to his will through fear and strategy. He'd thought that was strength. But this woman, this exhausted, terrified, impossibly brave woman, had shown him a different kind of strength. The strength to stay when running made sense. The strength to be gentle when the world was cruel. The strength to love without armor. I don't know how to do this, Ji-hoon admitted, his voice rough. I don't know how to be soft. How to feel things without it destroying me. Natasha's free hand came up to cup his face. Her touch warm despite the cold terror still coursing through her veins. "Then learn," she whispered. "You have time. You have him. You have—" She stopped herself, but the unspoken word hung in the air between them. "You have me." Ji-hoon closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, and for the first time in 6 months, maybe longer, he let himself break. No tears. Men like Ji-hoon Jung didn't cry, but his shoulders shook, his breath came in ragged gasps, and the weight of everything he'd been carrying finally cracked open. Natasha didn't speak. She just held his face, her thumb brushing over his cheekbone, grounding him the same way she grounded his son. Steady, calm, present. After a long moment, Ji-hoon pulled back. He stood, composing himself with visible effort, the armor sliding back into place but not quite as tightly as before. "Kang Dae," he called out. Dae appeared in the doorway instantly. "Yes, Hyungnim?" "Send everyone home." Dae blinked. "Sir?" "The guards, the staff, the captains, everyone except essential security perimeter. I want this floor cleared." Ji-hoon's tone was absolute. "I don't want to see anyone or hear from anyone unless the building is actively under siege. Understood?" But the CO response can wait until morning. Ji-hoon's gaze drifted back to Natasha and Sang-hoon. "I have more important things to protect right now." Dae hesitated, then nodded. Within 10 minutes, the penthouse was silent except for the distant hum of the city below. Ji-hoon found Natasha in the guest bedroom an hour later. She'd finally agreed to lie down, though she'd refused to let Sang-hoon out of her sight. The baby was curled beside her on the massive bed, still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the nightmare he'd survived. Natasha was on her side, one arm wrapped protectively around him, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. But she hadn't fully surrendered to sleep, her body was still coiled tight, still on alert. Ji-hoon stood in the doorway, watching them, his son and the woman who'd saved him. The two people who'd somehow become his entire world in the span of 8 weeks. The empire he'd built, the power, the fear, the control suddenly felt hollow. What good was ruling Seoul's underworld if he couldn't protect the only 2 people who mattered? He moved into the room silently, pulling a chair close to the bed. He sat, elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving them. Natasha's eyes fluttered open. "You should rest too," she murmured. "I will," Ji-hoon lied. "Later." "Ji-hoon, I need to know you're safe," he interrupted softly. "Both of you. So I'll watch, just for tonight." Natasha studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She understood. This wasn't about duty or obligation. This was about a man confronting the terrifying realization that he had something to lose. "Okay," she whispered. "Just for tonight." Her eyes closed. Her breathing deepened. And within minutes, exhaustion finally claimed her. Ji-hoon sat in the darkness, watching the steady rise and fall of their breathing. His son, and the woman who'd taught him that true strength wasn't about how much you could control, it was about what you chose to protect. The city outside began to wake car horns, distant sirens, the hum of millions of lives starting another day. But in that quiet room, time stood still, and Ji-hoon Jung feared Mafia King, architect of violence, master of shadows, learned what it felt like to be human again. It felt like terror, and it felt like hope, and he would burn the world to keep it. 6 weeks after the attack, the Jung estate felt different. The repairs were complete: new windows, restored walls, upgraded security systems. But the change ran deeper than architecture. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt restful. The staff no longer moved like ghosts. They hummed while they worked. They smiled. The mansion had learned to breathe. Natasha stood in the garden at dawn, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sang-hoon was still asleep. He slept through most nights now, confident in his safety. "And Ji-hoon, you're up early." She turned to find him approaching, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He'd changed too. The hard edges were still there, they always would be, but something had softened in his eyes. He wore gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt, his hair unstyled, his feet bare. He looked almost normal. "Couldn't sleep," Natasha admitted, accepting the coffee. "Too used to being awake at this hour." Ji-hoon stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They'd found this rhythm in recent weeks: proximity without pressure, comfort without demands. "I've been thinking," Ji-hoon said after a moment, "about your nursing program." Natasha's grip tightened on the mug. This conversation had been inevitable, but she'd been dreading it nonetheless. "Your deferment expires next month," Ji-hoon continued. "I spoke with the university. Your tuition has been paid in full for the next 3 years. Natasha's head snapped toward him. "You what?" "You're free to return to school, Natasha. Ji-hoon's voice was steady, but she caught the tension in his jaw. "The contract we signed, I'm nullifying the restriction clauses. You can come and go as you please. Resume your life." The words should have filled her with relief. Freedom. The future she'd put on hold. Instead, she felt her chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to loss. "What about Sang-hoon?" she asked quietly. Ji-hoon's expression flickered hope and fear warring beneath the surface. "That's your choice. I'm not holding you hostage anymore, Natasha. But I'm asking, not commanding if you'd consider staying part of his life. Part-time. Whatever works with your schedule. He needs you. And He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "It would mean a great deal. To both of us." Natasha looked down at her coffee, her mind racing. She could leave, walk away from the danger, the complicated web of Ji-hoon's world, the weight of everything that came with being connected to him. But she'd also be walking away from Sang-hoon's laughter, from watching him grow. From the strange, fragile thing that had grown between her and the man standing beside her, something that wasn't quite friendship, wasn't quite love, but felt essential nonetheless. "I'll stay," she said softly. "Not because of the money or the contract, but because that little boy in there deserves consistency. And because," she met Ji-hoon's eyes, "because I want to." The relief that flooded Ji-hoon's face was so profound it almost hurt to witness. "Thank you," he whispered. "But there are conditions," Natasha added, her voice firmer now. "No more surveillance. No more monitoring my calls. And you need to start actually trusting people. Me, your staff, your son. Control isn't strength, Ji-hoon. It's a cage, and you deserve to be free too." Ji-hoon was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden where morning light was breaking through the trees. "You're asking me to change who I am," he said finally. "No." Natasha stepped closer, her hand finding his arm. "I'm asking you to remember who you were before grief and fear took over. You're not just a crime lord, you're a father. A man who's capable of tenderness, even if you've forgotten how to show it." Ji-hoon looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple, it's terrifying." Natasha's smile was small but genuine. "But compassion is always scarier than cruelty, because it requires vulnerability. And you, Ji-hoon Jung, are terrified of being vulnerable." He didn't deny it. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You've taught me more in 3 months than I've learned in a lifetime," he said quietly. "How to let go, how to feel without breaking, how to be softer." "You're learning," Natasha said. "That's what matters." From inside the house, a baby's cry echoed, not distressed, just awake and ready for the day. They both smiled. "I'll get him," Ji-hoon said, but Natasha was already moving. "Together," she corrected. 3 months later, the nursery had become Natasha's favorite room in the entire estate, not because of the expensive furniture or the carefully curated toys, but because of the life in it. The walls were covered in Sang-hoon's finger paintings, messy, colorful, joyful. Photos lined the shelves. Sang-hoon's first steps, his first birthday, candid shots of him laughing in the garden. And in many of them, Ji-hoon smiled. Real smiles. Unguarded and warm. It was early evening, and Natasha had just returned from her clinical rotation at the hospital. She was exhausted but content, her scrubs wrinkled, her braids tied back in a practical bun. She found Ji-hoon in the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair with Sang-hoon in his lap. He was reading badly, with dramatic voices that made the toddler giggle uncontrollably. Natasha leaned against the doorframe, her heart swelling at the sight. Ji-hoon noticed her and paused mid-sentence, his expression softening. "How was work?" "Long. Good." She entered the room, collapsing onto the floor beside them. "Did I miss anything exciting?" Sang-hoon said a new word. Ji-hoon said, pride evident in his voice. "Oh, what word?" Ji-hoon looked at his son. "Show her." Sang-hoon looked directly at Natasha, his face lighting up. "Tasha!" Natasha's eyes immediately filled with tears. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, reaching up to stroke his cheek. "That's right, Tasha." Sang-hoon giggled and reached for her, wanting to be held by both of them at once. They maneuvered awkwardly until Natasha was sitting beside Ji-hoon's chair. The toddler sprawled across both their laps, perfectly content. For a moment, they looked like a family. And maybe, in their own complicated way, they were. "I need to tell you something," Ji-hoon said quietly, his eyes on his son. Natasha looked up at him, waiting. Ji-hoon's hand absently stroked Sung-hoon's hair, his voice thick with emotion. His mother Min-so, she gave me life when I had nothing. She saw past the violence, past the empire, and loved me anyway. She taught me that I was more than the monster everyone feared. He paused, his jaw working. She gave me peace, he continued. For 5 years, I knew what it felt like to be whole. And when she died, I thought that peace died with her, that I'd never feel it again. Natasha's throat tightened. Ji-hoon turned his head, meeting her eyes. But then you walked into that restaurant. You calmed my son with a touch. You challenged every rule I made. You refused to fear me. And slowly, so slowly, I didn't even notice you gave me both again. Both? Natasha whispered. Life, Ji-hoon said softly, his gaze intense. And peace. Sang-hoon yawned, oblivious to the weight of the moment, and snuggled deeper into their collective warmth. I'm not trying to replace her, Ji-hoon added quickly, his voice urgent. I'm not asking you to. I know, Natasha interrupted gently. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. You're not replacing her. You're healing. There's a difference. Ji-hoon closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, Natasha said with a small smile. But you've got me anyway. When Ji-hoon opened his eyes again, they were wet with unshed tears. I love you, he said simply, honestly, without expectation. Not as a possession, not as an obligation, just as you. Natasha Grant, the woman who walked into chaos and turned it into home. Natasha's breath caught. She'd known, of course, had felt it growing between them for weeks. But hearing it spoken aloud, raw and undefended, changed everything. I love you too, she whispered, even though you're impossible and controlling and occasionally terrifying. Ji-hoon laughed, a real, genuine laugh that made Sang-hoon look up in sleepy confusion. Occasionally? He asked. Don't push it. They sat together as the sun set outside, painting the nursery in shades of gold. Sang-hoon fell asleep in their arms, his breathing soft and even, perfectly safe. And for the first time in years, Ji-hoon Jung felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Peace. In a world ruled by fear, one woman's calm touch silenced the storm and taught a Mafia king how to love again. Wow. What a journey, right? If you made it this far, you're officially part of the storytelling family. Thank you for being here. Now here's what I need from you. Click that next video on your screen to continue the story, subscribe so you never miss an upload, and leave a comment telling me your favorite moment from today's chapter. Also, where are you watching from? I love seeing our community grow globally. Alright, friends, I'll see you in the next one. Click that screen.